Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. We have a very important topic to talk about in this webinar on women's economic justice, where we're looking at a wide-ranging topic around women's equity in the workplace, the things that impact women, such as domestic violence, and keep them from really making a contribution in society. I would like to start by thanking our partners in this webinar, Shared Interest, on just making this possible for us to have this conversation. I know that they do important work on the continent, especially in Southern Africa, to empower women from disenfranchised communities to make a living and to be able to sustain themselves and their communities. So thank you very much to them. I'd also like to welcome our panelists. We have a bit of an international flavor today, which is quite awesome. My name is Pumin Tlapo. I'm the COO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. And joining me from the US is Dr. Cynthia Spence, who is an associate professor of sociology at Spelman College. Dr. Spence, I'll continue to call you Cynthia from now on. Welcome. You do work on social justice and intersectional feminism and looking at gender-based violence and exploring ways that institutions can stop replicating violence against women. So thank you very much for joining us all the way from the US.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Lee Conrad, who's the Managing Director of Conrad Advisory. Lee has extensive experience working in the private sector and looking at barriers to women entrepreneurs and what keeps them from flourishing in society and what can be done to fix that. Lee, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you, Lee. And then our third speaker is Sanem Dlalose from Smart Start South Africa. She's the Chief Growth Officer there. Smart Start work in the early learning sector, helping children in their formative years to become successful and also empowering women to run their own play groups as facilitators. Sanet, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Pumi. Glad to be here.
Awesome. I guess I'll start the conversation with you, Cynthia. And, you know, in the US, it is Domestic Violence Month at the moment, and which is something quite close to our hearts, I suppose, here in South Africa, because it's quite an endemic problem here as well. We've had a pretty rough time as society with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think it's exposed fault lines in a lot of societies. One of them being the rise in domestic violence. What are your insights? What can you share in terms of the impact of the pandemic on domestic violence, and specifically, what is the extent of it now and what is driving it?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Pumi, and to all of these great panelists that you're giving me the honor of participating in this discussion with. And also thank you to Shared Interest. Before I talk specifically about the pandemic, I want to talk about the reality that there are certain universals that we share. So while I'm sitting here in the US, and many of you are in Southern Africa, we know that there are certain universal conditions that serve as kind of breeding grounds for violence against women and for gender violence. And so we know that there are that violence in general is something that's celebrated in our societies, and that the social structures and our national structures in many ways create policies that condone violence. We know that the media celebrates violence. So violence surrounds us, whether we're sitting in Atlanta, Georgia, or sitting in Cape Town, South Africa. We know that there is an adherence to patriarchal structures in our societies, and this is a universal. And that adherence does, in fact, encourage hegemonic masculinity, which does, in fact, place men at the center of the family structure, places men in leadership positions, and that often condones the subservience and devaluation of women. And then we know that there are often very oppressive structural systems that don't necessarily support the needs of women. And certainly I'm not doing all statements, but I do say that there are certain universals that we look at. And so when we think about the pandemic, and many have called it kind of the increased rates of domestic violence, the shadow pandemic, because we know that the pandemic caused us to kind of reimagine our lives, but also to, in fact, have fewer safe spaces because of social distancing. So isolation due to social distancing meant that individuals who perhaps prior to the pandemic had options, had community supports, had people that they could even talk with about what was occurring within the family structure. Those connections were severed due to social distancing, which was a necessary outcome of the pandemic, but yet it did in fact exacerbate some of the violent experiences of individuals within the home settings, within their community settings. We know that the pandemic also caused loss of income. And the loss of income also served to exacerbate the kind of the devaluation of the contributions of women, but also contributions of men to the household. And oftentimes when we have a loss of income, there are certain frustrations that are associated with that. We know that in both communities within the US and as well as in South Africa, that oftentimes income is in fact a sign of masculinity. Income actually supports the views that men should be the head of the household. And income also serves as a factor which causes great dependency upon women to depend upon men in many circumstances, because we know that in the US and in South Africa that men are making more money than women. And that's across class sectors as well, because oftentimes we focus on lower income groups, but we know across sectors that women still don't make as much as men. We also know that the pandemic caused a lot of frustrations. There were losses, there was sadness, there was anger. And oftentimes we don't know how to express that anger. We don't know how to express the frustration and the sadness. And sometimes that will in fact manifest itself through aggression and aggressive actions toward family members. And so that also increased the rates of domestic violence. And then we know that the social networks were in fact diminished because individuals could not congregate. They could not go out and be with other family members who perhaps did not live with them. There were no safe havens. And then lastly, the resources, shelters. And I know in the US, shelters always have limits, but certainly during the pandemic, there had to be different ways of supporting women in the community because we could not actually house individuals due to social distancing. So certainly the pandemic was an aggravating factor to the realities of the existence of many women in their households. Many of us are very privileged to see the home as a safe space, but that is not necessarily true for many women. We know that women lost jobs due to the pandemic. And again, this is another aggravating factor. And so when we look at the cost, the actual economic costs in the US, and there are varied statistical calculations, but it ranges from $8 to $12 billion a year the cost of domestic violence to our society. In South Africa, it ranges from like 22 to $28 billion a year. And so how is that calculated? It's usually calculated in terms of cost of services for women who have to be treated or for treated by medical facilities due to their experiencing of various forms of physical violence. Cost economic losses because individuals can't go to work, or when they are not able to work consistently. And so the productivity of work enterprises are affected by that. So again, decreased productivity, psychological harm that's very hard to calculate or to quantify, but we know that individuals who are involved in domestic violence situations are emotionally abused as well, and that psychological harm can manifest itself in a variety of ways. And so we know that there are a number of economic losses at the individual, but actually at the societal level that are difficult to calculate. But we know that that they do exist. Police services, training for police officers to better respond to domestic violence situations. So there are a number of costs, and the pandemic did not help. It aggravated these circumstances. And I believe that we're still trying to work our way out of it. And in the US, we believe that there is some movement to open up shelters more. But again, this is a very difficult problem for all of us to address. But it is, in fact, a call for more structured responses and more conversations like this to think about what are the solutions, because we definitely know what the problem is and we know the sources of the problem. So how do we begin to become more creative in solutions?
Much for that background. Very, very relatable for us here in South Africa. I'd like to move on to Leah now, and just Leah, you work with women entrepreneurs, women in formal employment in South Africa. What barriers are they encountering, these women that are trying to make an impact out there in society?
So I'd like to give some context to the subject before I answer the question directly. I really believe that harnessing the economic potential of women should be on the global agenda, pretty much at the same level that we are talking about a response to climate change. It is really, really critical to ensure that women have access to equal opportunities so that we can create economic growth and also to create and build flourishing societies. In saying this, I'd like to mention a finding that is quite pertinent, and that is that women typically invest a higher percentage of their earnings and their income into their families and communities than men do. In fact, the statistics indicate that women invest up to 90% of that income into their families and into communities, whereas men invest between 30 and 40% of their earnings or income. And that's primarily spent on food, healthcare, home improvement, and schooling. So within that context, and one thinks then about the barriers that women experience, and just building on what Cynthia's already said, my view on the barriers that are found are that some of it is rooted in cultural, religious, and societal values that can create and do create unconscious yet inherent biases. So we do live in a very patriarchal society, and women are not considered on an equal footing to men, especially in the workplace. It does lead to quite a high degree of gender stereotyping. And, there's a study that indicated that women leaders are seen as competent or likable, really both. And women also work much, much harder to prove their competence, and they spend some of their time trying to dispel some of the gender stereotypical perceptions that exist. They also work so hard to prove that level of competence, and yet they are not rewarded at the same level as their male counterparts. So that's one of the first barriers I'd like to mention. The second is access to affordable childcare options. I know that Sane will be talking to this, but it is definitely a barrier for any woman entrepreneur or any woman in the workplace. The third is the widening gender pay gap. The fourth is limited access to financial support, whether this is for access to working capital, access to credit, or to growing a business. And the last is really relates to skills and competence. And it's really having the right to access to the right mix of skills, knowledge, competence, and experience at a higher education level. And we know South Africa's background in terms of the education system, and that it is extremely, and it continues to be extremely unequal. So that is a major barrier when one thinks of the barriers that women face on, as they're trying to grow their businesses, or alternatively, as they're trying to climb that corporate ladder. Thank you.
Very much for that. I think, maybe I should just jump to Sane, because Lee already mentioned the one barrier around affordable, reliable, effective childcare. Sane, Smart Start works in this area. What insights can you share around this, and what is Smart Start doing to address the problem?
Thank you, Pumi. And I think, the first thing really is to understand that within the South African context, we currently have an ECD sector or childcare sector, which is structured or led by the market, which means those with resources have more services and those without resources have none. If you take that context and you look at our environment, you'll see that of the 1.3 million children that don't have access to quality childcare and ECD services, 67% are sitting in our most vulnerable communities. And that's really because of the costs, or what we call structural barriers, which is one, cost, availability of land and infrastructure to build childcare facilities, and then on the other hand, affordability of childcare facilities. What Smart Start does is we look at how do we actually overcome those barriers? How do we create an environment where childcare and ECD services are accessible to even the most vulnerable communities through a model which offers a play-based sort of curriculum, but in a way that makes it affordable and relevant to the community. So as a result, what we've been able to do is we set up home and community-based sites, which enable those in the most vulnerable communities to have sites established within close proximity of where they reside. This in turn allows women who are, to Lee's point, disproportionately carry a disproportionate responsibility for childcare and looking after children, allows these women who are often having left school early, so the girl child that doesn't get an opportunity to finish school, or they are underemployed or unemployed. It allows them an opportunity to move and start to participate in the economy, because nearby there is a home-based site or community-based site where they are able to take their children. And therefore, we offer this opportunity of not only safe spaces for the children, but at the same time offer quality childcare, which is really about enabling children to be in a safe space where they can learn in their environment, using the resources that exist in the community, therefore overcoming these other barriers which prevent access and prevent the right number of sites being available for, which will allow women to therefore then be able to go find work. Because once they find work, we need people to be able to afford the care being offered. And we not only just want normal care, we want good quality care. So it's quite important that when we think about childcare, we think about quality childcare and how we take quality to the communities, where quality is possible, irrespective of the resources within that community. Thank you.
I guess it's also empowering the ladies that start these businesses as well, providing the childcare. So you're helping the mother to be able to be economically active, but you're also empowering the caregiver to have economic agency as well.
In 100%, because if you look at childcare in general, it's really seen as being the main change for socio-economic from an investment perspective. You have a triple impact. You have an opportunity of enabling a child to perform better at school. I think recently when the Minister of Education was speaking for higher education, saying that only 4% of graduates are passing at that level. They recognize it was a lack of a strong foundation. So the foundation start that gives children a better future is very important. Secondly, the opportunity of women to actually be employed and be employable within the sector. And thirdly, the opportunity of enabling women. Women are currently sort of constitute 85% of the care givers who work in the care economy. And that 85% is predominantly between 10 and 2 and 10 times of that is actually unpaid at this stage. So how do we create an environment where we create sustainable jobs in that environment? If you look at it at a global level, there was a report done by the World Bank in 2020, which said if we can use this triple impact model, we can create a situation where 43 million job opportunities are created. If we move that to the South African context, you're looking at a sector level to enable sites to exist with practitioners that are qualified to deliver a quality program. You're looking at an opportunity for 450,000 jobs to be created, but an opportunity for another 2.8 million people to get access to the economy. Now, if we look at it also from a Smart Start perspective, we recognize that women and the girl child are typically have less education. They don't necessarily have the education that meets the requirements of even a matric. And in most cases, you need the matric to move forward. So when you look at what we do as Smart Start, we look at the unemployed and underemployed, and where we take people without a matric, we equip them with the skills to be able to deliver a quality evidence-based program, which in turn allows them to enter and participate more actively in the economy and therefore earn a more meaningful livelihood.
Awesome. Thank you, Sane. I would like to go back to Cynthia in a moment, but I would like to also just invite our audience, if you have questions, please pose them so we can have a more robust conversation. But Cynthia, just to go back to you, you mentioned the fact that the pandemic brought to us a widening of the pay gap.
Yes.
So there's institutionally things that have gone wrong that are actually exacerbating the problem of domestic violence, the problem just of inequality in general. What do you think should be done? Like, what intersectional approach should be taken by institutions to really address the fundamental structural changes that we're seeing to enable women to really thrive in society?
Yes, well, certainly Lee and Sunny are doing amazing work. Certainly focusing in on the training and development of more women entrepreneurs is something that is very important because the entrepreneurship opportunities create independence and income. And so that is very important. I know in the US, Black women are the largest demographic of new entrepreneurship projects. And this is something that is very important because it's empowering, but it also helps to increase the agency of women to be able to make choices about their lives when they have income, and income provides some level of freedom. And I say some level of freedom because, again, we know that in both countries there is a pay gap. And so we must, in fact, push our legislators to address issues of the pay gap. And I know that is more difficult in some settings than others. And certainly it's been difficult in the US. But again, the pay differentials are in fact placing women in positions of dependency, and that dependency oftentimes does in fact create an environment where they have to accept violent behaviors. And I'm not just saying physical violence, but also emotional violence, creating opportunities for childcare, because childcare often is, as is stated, not just in South Africa, but in the US as well. It is the primary role of women. And once again, across class. And so we certainly want to create more opportunities where you have government subsidized childcare. But then again, as Sonny indicated, the workers, these are women who are low wage workers. And so we must, in fact, begin to value the work of individuals who work with our children. I mean, the reality is they are, in fact, shaping and influencing the future generations. And so we should value that work. We also need to begin to look at education and training. I'm at Spelman College, a women's college, and it has always been our goal to educate women so that they can be empowered to be able to make decisions for themselves. And this isn't anti-male, it is just pro-women and the development of women. And we know that education is in fact a tool for social progress. It is a tool for status mobility. And so governmental policies that impact the education of women and girls, governmental policies that subsidize the education of women and girls is very important, because without education, there are not many opportunities for status mobility. And so certainly education and training, vocational training that is targeted to women and the work that they do. Again, when women are in the workplace, there must be policies to make certain that they are protected. Again, Lee mentioned that women in the workplace, they're either, considered competent or not. And so certainly the structures within the workplace have to be conducive to the work of women, because women bring value to the organization, and that they should not be considered subservient. They should be treated in the same way if they have the same talents and skills as others. And so there must be policies in that area. And then lastly, I would say in terms of the healthcare sector, we must do better by providing healthcare services to all individuals and making them more affordable, and making certain that individuals can, in fact, afford to take care of themselves and their families. Reproductive justice policies. Certainly, these are policies that in the US, particularly, we are in many ways retrogressing. And what will that mean for women and women's lives who don't have agency over their own reproductive justice decision making? So there are many areas within the larger structural society that need to be changed, need to be addressed as we begin to think about how do we create greater agency for women at all levels, and how do we begin to value the work of women and the contributions that they make as caregivers, as mothers, as daughters, those who take care of the elderly. How do we value that in a monetized way? And so again, I believe that at the structural level, there's a lot that we can do, but it will in fact depend on activism and advocacy among all, not just women, but for men who are also very sensitive to the ways in which women's lives and the experiences of women have been in many ways marginalized, when we think about policies that can in fact empower them, to give them the agency so that they will not be dependent upon family situations that are toxic. And I believe that it's a big task, but I believe it's something that we can, in fact, join hands together and begin to mount various advocacy agendas to address each of these issues. Thank you.
Cynthia, thank you very much. One of the things you mentioned is around the fact that in the US, more African American women are becoming entrepreneurs. So
Yeah.
we're seeing women taking matters into their own
Yes.
hands, their
Yes.
livelihoods in their own hands, which is quite encouraging.
Yes.
If I can just move to Lee on the same sort of theme, Lee. Earlier this year, MasterCard released a study basically highlighting the fact that in South Africa is one of the 12 economies in the world where women's entrepreneurial activity has increased, which is, I suppose, quite encouraging. What are some of the unique opportunities that you're seeing for women entrepreneurs, and what support systems do they need to really succeed in business?
Thank you for the question. Just before I answer the specific questions, let's just have a general conversation about the report. I haven't looked at exactly how the methodology works, so I'll talk about it in fairly general terms. I noted that South Africa was ranked 37th in this round, which is, they do the study annually, and it moved up one place, yet the score decreased marginally. And as I read the report, I noticed that the increase in entrepreneurial activities in South Africa was primarily driven by female necessity-driven entrepreneurship, which increased from 63% to 91%, rather than opportunity-based entrepreneurship, which increased by 6%. So in my view, as I reflected on that, particularly within a post-pandemic environment where economic growth is extremely low, it reflects the tenacity and resilience of women faced with a need to have an income. So I think it really resonates with what Cynthia's also spoken about the increase in entrepreneurship. I do think, though, that challenges, whatever they may be, can create opportunities, though there is this need to create greater support for women to take advantage of the changes, particularly in a post-COVID environment. We've seen rapid digitization over the last few years, and I think in 2020 we were talking about the fourth industrial revolution. In a few years, suddenly it was thrust upon us, and there's a great need at the moment to have access to affordable digital training, resources necessary, etc. Another area of growth is, in my view, is the green economy. Where in transitioning towards a green economy, new skills are needed. This is an area I'm pretty passionate about, and whether the skills that are needed will be in the provision of solar energy through a system design or installation or manufacture, I see it as an area of opportunity because many of the skills don't currently exist. We do know that funds are being made available to South Africa to fund what is called the just transition. So this is where the country is going to move from a coal-based economy towards a low carbon, climate resilient economy. So what we need to do is to think about how do we access those funds? How do we ensure that women-owned businesses can tap into that, both from a perspective of creating businesses, but also from a perspective of thinking about what are the skills and ensuring that the correct skills and competence and knowledge exists across the country so that women can participate in the new green economy that is being talked about. There's also, I see an opportunity to empower women entrepreneurs to find better ways of how to improve their businesses, whether it's through manufacturing techniques and being able to scale up their businesses rather than remaining at that very, very small level. So that will talk to creating the accessible avenues to working capital, to access credit, and to find innovative financial mechanisms. I think there's a great need to have many conversations about financial inclusivity, what that means, and how to actually achieve it. And just to continue along the lines of these supportive systems, there's definitely a need to create an enabling environment. And to go back to some of the issues I mentioned under barriers, one needs to have conversations that cover things like how do we talk about the cultural values that can often hold women back, and that women will always have family responsibilities. I think we need to have courageous conversations about the inherent biases and the unconscious biases that continue to exist. We also cannot ignore the fact that we live in a country where domestic and partner violence is endemic, and this too has to change. So whilst there are opportunities, we have to recognize that there are many things that we need to tackle and have those courageous conversations and talk about how do we change things for the better so that we can unlock the economic potential that women have to grow our economy and to create these flourishing societies and flourishing communities. Thank you.
Very much. If I can go to Sane, because this issue of care work, it's very much been seen as just something that women must do, not much in terms of compensation. How do we, in addition to the other fields that that Lee just spoke about in terms of the green economy, etc., how do we elevate care work and treat it as work worthy of it's valuable and it needs to be compensated? I mean, is there even space for government support for that type of thing? Because I think COVID showed us the importance of care work more than anything. It really, really humbled us. What are your views on that?
So I think the issue around enabling funding for care work is twofold. What we find in our society is that with younger children, sort of 0 to 2 years old, the concept and principle of understanding that we need to contribute, or as a parent, I need to pay for some support to look after my child is there. The issue always becomes one of, does the parent actually have the resources to pay? When it comes to the children that are slightly older, 3 to 5 years old, it then becomes about what's the value of the quality of learning that the child is getting by going to the certain facility. What we see is that when there's an understanding of the quality, and parents can see the development of a child, the enhancement of a child, parents' willingness to pay is there. However, if we think about it in the context that the majority of our country are not in a position to pay, even if they would like to pay for the service, we then need to look to government and other systems that enable. What we've seen over time is there was very little funding support from a government side going to ECD, and that was a function of a combination of policy and the market-led structure of it. More recently, and I think with COVID, some of the first initiatives to support this sector and childcare came to life, but were hindered in terms of from a practical perspective of the ability to pay, because as we look at these communities and these women, they often, to both Leah and Cynthia's points, are not necessarily able or have access to the facilities such as bank accounts and things which you need to have a business, and therefore the passing of funds is limited. So what we need is a combination of enabling policy, enabling processes within government which allow for what you could call home and community-based childcare to be able to be understood and actually get support from government in terms of child subsidies, because the norms and standards have been adapted, making compliance easier and more relevant, which will then allow funds to flow. That, coupled with enabling those of us who are in the NGO space and other sectors, focusing on developing the credentials and training the women to become more competent and be able to deliver the quality. The two things working hand in hand will enable the sector to improve. And then along the way, as parents get more exposure to being able to work, they're able to start paying and contributing to their livelihood. So there's an aspect where we have to see how we reduce the costs of childcare, which is from nutrition support and all those other expenses, to how we enable money to flow through government, and then how we enable improving the actual quality of delivery and upskilling the providers of childcare services, be it for 0 to 2 or 3 to 5, how we equip them to start delivering quality care for the children, which enables learning long term.
Thank you very much. So I'm now looking for hope and optimism in light of, seeing a light in all of the darkness, because this is what Archbishop Tutu was all about. Earlier this month, we celebrated both his and Mama Leah's birthdays, and just would like a final word from any of you. I'm not going to pinpoint one panelist at this point, but what do you see moving forward? Are we winning? Are we making a difference? I know COVID kind of set us back, but is there a light? Who would like to pick that one up?
Okay, I'm happy to start. I think there's very much light. I think, we've seen improved number of sites. We've seen increased work across a variety of partners, whether it's with Smart Start, Real Reform, and others advocating for policy change. We've seen with the shift from DSD to DBE, very much a keenness on government to engage and find solutions that work. So I think the question is, as we fix the processes, as the advocacy and the policies start to adapt, how do we sustain the sites and growth in the meantime? And as the whole, and then what we really need is public-private partnerships. We need also corporates to come to the party to support government, because the task at hand is significant. And in some ways, corporates are very well positioned in the shorter term to start supporting the trajectory as all the other things and policies start to change and communities start to shift in the positive. So I think we've seen significant move, but we need to understand that relative to the task and the gap, and the need to accelerate the gap quickly, we need to move a bit faster. And there we really, really need the private sector to come in and assist with the processes as we evolve on the government side as well.
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes.
Cynthia?
Um, I see light, particularly in the U.S. context, because I believe that we have an infrastructure that is in place to respond to the various needs that we've been discussing. And certainly we talked about the rise in Black women's entrepreneurship. We talked about actually what I didn't mention is that the higher education rates for Black women are higher, one among the highest group as well. And so when we're talking about Black women, and I do, and maybe I'm just biased, but I just believe education is the key. And certainly we need to be able to mimic some of the good things that we're seeing, and then also try to join the public and private sector in addressing the really what seem to be impenetrable systems that continue to keep women down. And we must, we have to vocalize that. And so as a board member of Shared Interests, I'm very much interested in this project because of my own passions around violence against women or gender violence, but also for my love of South Africa and Southern Africa and Cape Town, or in particular. So I just want to work with others like Lee and Sane on how do we, have strategies to address these issues. Again, we know what the problems are. I think we need to move beyond just kind of talking about what the problems are, because we know what they are. And how do we then collaborate to try to build solutions that may be small, but every incremental change is change. So I've just been honored to be in conversation with you all, because I believe this is a part of the solution.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Lee, you have the final word.
Thank you. I always think that there has to be light at the end of the tunnel. And whilst when we've been talking about the challenges, I think it's just been well said there by Cynthia that, we know what they are. We now need to find the solutions. And I think that the opportunity for a collective conversation is, we one starts, because even listening to my fellow panelists today, there are so many great ideas that I've heard, and one can collaborate across so many different spheres, whether it's public, private, whether it's, across the pond, as you said earlier. But there are ways of really making a significant difference. And I see, for argument's sake, the opportunity in investing in renewable technologies as an area that can really take us forward, as well as looking at digitization. And I think I've seen one of the questions or comments there that we have to accept that as far as digitization is concerned, virtually everyone in the country has a cell phone, and many, many, many people have smartphones. So we are moving in the right direction. We just need to harness the energy that I've certainly heard today, and put that to work to find workable solutions. Thanks.
Thank you very much to my panelists. Thank you to the audience as well. I noted the questions and the comments around entrepreneurship being the key. Also, just how do we deal with the patriarchy? I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and hopefully partnerships get formed to try and address some of these issues. As we wrap up, I would like to give Archbishop Tutu the final word, because we at the foundation really are driven by his vision for society and his vision for the world. I ask your indulgence. We would like to play out with a video where he really emphasizes his viewpoints on many issues, one of them being women and how we should not sideline women in any way, shape, or form in society. So thank you very, very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the audience. It's been a fruitful discussion, and I feel like it's the beginning of collaborations moving forward. And I'm quite excited about that. I'm happy that the foundation is in the middle of that. Thank you to Shared Interest as well. Gosh, for making this possible. I remember the day we met Anne, and we weren't quite sure how we would work together, but this is good. It's the start of good things. So if I can just ask Sean to play us out with the hopefully gain some inspiration from the Archer's words. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
The tidal wave of change is made up of a million ripples. Says, hey, he's done that. Maybe I can. And it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up. You can change the world. You can change the world. Must not pause now. Do not let them down. Maybe I can. And it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up.
Evangeli ndayishumayela njengoTutu onendlela kunetyala ndizuthula tutu sifuna lenguqu asinova ngamatututu sikuyo le ndlela asijiki tu.
Person is a person to other person. The essence of being human.
Ithumigcwele nababantu kubuntu abanye sebenikezele bathakhondi kubuntu Qondo sisithobe sithola uthuthu xa sikuthuntu asincedisani noluntu kodwa inyala nefuntu.
A person is a person to other person.
Bafayina ulwazi abantwana nale ndlala incamathele inkokheli zingozidlele bayahlutha sibukele.
Age is not over. Whoever is the perpetrator, as long as I have breath in my body, I will speak up against injustice. Watch out. Watch out. To narrow the gap between the have and the have-not. I cannot worship a homophobic God. Wouldn't it be wonderful if
babesithandana ntombi namfana sikhululekile?
Wouldn't it be wonderful
babe sikwazi uvana nobulwimi lwethu lohlukile.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if
babe siphilisana nendalo kuba lo mhlaba siphiwe siyaya phambili ixesha lethu selifikile.
climate change is for real? It is the younger generation leading the way. Do what you can, where you can. Do not let them down. You must not pause now. Women are excluded just simply and solely because they are women. And it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up. The tidal wave of change is made up of a million ripples.